everyone, and welcome back to the Wellness on Purpose podcast. It's your host, Marissa, here, and I'm really excited to bring you today's episode featuring Brett Hawes, who is here representing an incredible company called Botanica. Botanica is a Canadian company, and their philosophy is to bring the highest quality natural health products to people just like you and me, that upholds the value of environmental and social responsibilities, which I think is incredibly important when we are thinking about the products in which we are investing our hard-earned dollars in, when a company is actually wanting to make an impact and taking into consideration both the environmental and the social impact when they are creating, processing, and manufacturing their specific supplement products. Also, Botanica promises 3 things with all of the products that they formulate. They ensure that they use whole plant ingredients rather than extracts. They have a rigorous crafting process to ensure that their product has the highest absorption, bioavailability, and concentration. And lastly, they are passionate about keeping herbal traditions as they are, which have been perfected over time. Not only in this episode is Brett sharing about his incredible knowledge as a nutritionist, he is also sharing about his details in how Botanica produces their greens powder, why they have less ingredients but at a higher concentration than most other greens powders, and who could benefit from taking a greens powder. So let's not waste any more time and welcome Brett onto our podcast. Good morning, Brett. Welcome to the Wellness on Purpose podcast. We are so excited to have you here today. How are you doing?
I am doing great. Thank you, Marissa. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. I'm so happy to have you on our podcast today. And we're going to talk a little bit about Botanica as a company. So we carry this at Joanne's Place. Many of our listeners right now will recognize the name. And we're going to dive into specifically the greens product. But before we do that, how about you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do for Botanica as a company, and then we'll get into the products.
Sure. So for me, I've been in the field of, alternative medicine and health and wellness for almost 20 years now. I have a clinic, so it's a virtual clinic. I've kind of pioneered that over the last 6 years, but I've been practicing for about 17 or 18 years now. Mostly functional medicine, clinical nutrition. I'm trained in Ayurvedic medicine and detoxification. So I've done a whole bunch of additional training in addition to that. But then I also teach at the Institute of Holistic Nutrition, and I'm a student clinic advisor there. So that's kind of, and I host my own podcast. So if anyone is into listening to podcasts, it's called Holistic Health Masterclass Podcast. You can just look that up, Holistic Health Masterclass. And I guess you could say I've been steeped in this environment for a long time, and I've got a pretty broad background. With Botanica, I do a lot of their product education. So, pre-pandemic, I would actually travel a lot. I would go on tours, out west, around Toronto, and basically go to health food stores and educate a lot of the people that work in the health food stores. And of course, since then, we've kind of taken everything online. I do a lot of webinars. I do a lot of consumer webinars as well as retail webinars as well. That's kind of, so I always bring the clinical side of things into the products when I talk about them. And I think people always get a lot of value out of that.
Absolutely. And in the last year, the webinars have really, boomed in this industry, which is fantastic for consumers and retailers. So that's fantastic. So how long have you been a practicing nutritionist?
Yeah, so I've been doing that since about 2005. So 16 years. I was dabbling a little bit before then, but that's when I actually trained, got certified, and then functional medicine kind of came a little bit after that. Now bringing in things like lab testing and that sort of stuff into the fold as well. So, I deal mostly, I'll just say this much, I deal with a lot of chronic and complex issues in practice. So I don't deal with simple stuff. I deal with autoimmune disease, hormone imbalances, and GI issues. That's kind of my wheelhouse. I would say 90% of my time is spent there, but also comfortable with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, metabolic health, and stuff like that.
Amazing. So as a practitioner, then you would use botanical products in your practice with your clients as well?
Yeah, so I do. Obviously, as a practitioner, you kind of have to look out for the best interests of the people you're working with. So, I have other companies that I work with as well in a clinical setting. But there's definitely, I know we're going to talk about greens powders today, But I will just say the liquid capsules I use quite a bit because they're so potent. And just to give some people a general idea, two of the capsules is equivalent to around 8 to 10 dry herb capsules. So your capsules that you would get of dry herbs that are usually around 450, 500, 550 milligrams, it would be equivalent to taking 10 of those. And if you actually look at the concentration of the tincture inside of the capsules, because that's what they are, they're liquid capsules, you'll see that they're in pretty much like a 2-to-1 dilution, which means that normal tincture would be 4 parts or 5 parts alcohol to 1 part herb, right? These are 2 parts to 1, and some of them are actually even more concentrated. So the point being that you really get a good bang for your buck, but also it means that you're taking 2 capsules instead of taking 10, or instead of going through bottles of tinctures in every 3 or 4 days. So I find that the patient response is phenomenal with those. And I will also say that if you have digestive issues, the killer combo that I use in clinic all the time is the digestive herbal bitters with the fermented shots. So we have these medicinal kombuchas. That those two together, like I get people off digestive enzymes just by doing that for a few months. So, yeah. So, but I know we'll talk about greens powders today. I mean, the protein powder is awesome. I love Botanica. I got to say, I've worked with a bunch of companies and advised a lot of companies, but Botanica is definitely right at the top of my list.
Yes, I'm so happy that you mentioned that actually about the herbs, because I myself am also a practicing nutritionist, and I use Botanica, especially the turmeric. I find that that's one of their best products. I see such great results with my clients in terms of inflammation through the body, whether it's joints, GI system, and they have to take much less of it, which is so much better, obviously, in compliance for them, so they don't have to take it so often or so many times through the day. But it's also much more affordable that way than having to buy a product that you have to take so many of and go through so quickly. So I'm happy that you mentioned that. Aside from that, as an aspect from Botanica, can you talk a little bit more about the company and where they started from? Are they Canadian? And give our listeners just a quick rundown about Botanica as a company.
Yeah, so Botanica is a Canadian company. They're based in Vancouver, and basically we consider ourselves artists of good nutrition, right? So a couple of highlights I'll share with you is we are always about clean products. So if you actually go through our whole product line, you will see that we don't use any binders or fillers or flow agents or anything like that, pretty much throughout the whole product line. So literally, even on the greens powder, all you see is greens. Like that's it. On the protein powder, it's just protein. There's nothing else. I think that's one thing. And of course, I would say pretty much everything that we're doing is organic. Obviously, in some of the formulations, we might be sourcing ingredients that might be, wildcrafted or biodynamically grown or what have you. And maybe they don't have the actual organic certification. But of course, we're always striving to kind of push that forward. Botanica doesn't use any extracts at all, which I think is also important. So when you get into the world of herbs, it's very easy to air quotes adulterate a product if you want by artificially spiking it. So you could take cavacol, for example, which is the medicinal compound in oregano oil, and you could basically just keep adding that until you got to 95% cavacol, right? And then what you would do is say, we have the highest amount of cavacol, therefore our product is better. What we've found, and kind of what we hold true to, is the fact that when you look at herbs, there's all the other synergistic properties in the herbs. So instead of just focusing so much on curcumin or cavacol or whatever it is, we would rather do broader spectrum extractions so that we can actually capture all of the volatile oils, the essential oils, the other compounds, because that's really how nature provided it. So you're going to find that throughout the whole product line, we don't use any extracts at all. We're not spiking anything. And the next thing is that with the herbs, we're also not jumping onto the latest and greatest, like trendy herbs, right? You'll see that the herbs that we use in all of our formulations have a long history in traditional Chinese medicine, in Ayurvedic medicine, and in herbal medicine, generally speaking. So I think that kind of sums it up. Now, once you get outside of the products, Botanica is a B Corp certified company, and I'll just give you the highlights for B Corp. Basically, it goes, once you look beyond the products, you're basically then looking at things like socioeconomic impacts, right? So where are we sourcing our ingredients from? Fair trade, direct trade, stuff like that. Making sure that the employees are taken care of. And I will say, as someone who's a contractor who's working with them, they take really good care of the people that work there. That's part of B Corp. The other core component of B Corp certified is that there's a very, very strong environmental stewardship component. So you'll see right down to the fish oils, for example. All of the fish that we're using have actually been certified through a fishery commission to basically say that these have been sustainably harvested fish, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at the boxes that we use, those have all gone through a forestry commission. So we're actually using, essentially sustainably logged materials to make the boxes. And then the ink is actually vegetable-based ink as well. So it's non-toxic. So kind of, once you start getting into the layers, you'll see that Botanica is not just, pretty marketing and high quality formulas. There's the whole other component that's going on in the background as well, which I personally love. The last thing I'll say is we also partner with other artisans. So, for example, if we identify that someone has, like the kombuchas, for example, well, those kombuchas are very, very difficult to make. So we partner with someone who knows how to make them and to the highest quality standards, right? So I think that's, in a nutshell, that's a little bit about Botanica. And once you get stuck into them and research a little bit, I think you'll fall in love with them.
Great. I'm so happy that you touched on all those points, because there's a lot of supplement companies out there that are constantly chasing the trend. They want to stay relevant. They want to have as many SKUs as they can on the shelf. And we see that a lot. And that's one approach to brand awareness. But I appreciate that you talked about, those ancient traditional herbs in which have been studied for many years that work, and also that holistic approach to it. So not just the extract, but all the other components that come with it. So as I mentioned, as a practicing nutritionist and wellness advocate, I'm always looking to find, the best products that are affordable, that encompass that holistic practice. And one thing I want to talk about today, which we mentioned already, is the greens powder, because for this month of March with our listeners, we're really promoting a healthy daily routine that's really nourishing for the skin and the body. And I myself use the greens powder, and I find that this is a huge benefit into my daily routine. And I think a lot of people could benefit from taking a greens powder. So first off, let's get to the basics of talking about vegetables before even jumping into supplementation. What would you say is a daily recommended vegetable intake for an average person?
So if you look at government guidelines, you're looking at around 8 to 10 servings, give or take. Now, obviously, if you have underlying health conditions where maybe you cannot tolerate vegetables for whatever reason, you can't tolerate the fibers, you might have to drop that down a little bit. But generally speaking, you're looking at around 8 servings per day, 8 to 10.
And I'm sure you see this in practice, but one of the biggest struggles that I see with my clients is consuming that adequate amount of vegetables. So what's the difference between having a handful of greens versus having a powdered greens supplement?
Well, just to back up a sec, you're spot on. And I think because we live in Canada, the cold winters, you don't really want to be eating salads all day long. It's not actually good for your constitution from an Ayurvedic or from a Chinese medicine perspective, right? So, that the cold, dry, rough properties of too much raw vegetables ongoing can actually aggravate your constitution. So you're right. People basically don't get enough of those vegetables. But if you were to kind of put things into perspective, right? If you look at our greens powder, so our perfect greens, just the plain one that's super, super green, just to put it into perspective, one scoop of that has 8 servings of vegetables in it and fruits. So and it's one scoop. I mean, the scoop is not very big. So really what we're talking about is concentration. So if I was to try and get that in one scoop on my plate, I would literally have to load my plate up with probably more vegetables than I could even eat, right? So there's that side of things. And the other side of things is nutrient density when it comes to calories, right? So if you're eating your 8 servings of vegetables per day, which is great, you now have to digest all of that. You have to look at the caloric intake as well. There's a lot of carbohydrates that are going on there. So, again, people that might be following low carb diets or might be looking more towards the keto side of things, which is very popular now, that's going to be very difficult to do that type of eating plan when you're consuming a large volume of vegetables. Okay, so essentially what greens powders do is they make things nutrient dense, right? So lower caloric intake, but the nutrient values are sky high.
Yes, and one thing you mentioned about having a large amount of vegetables is the fiber aspect, and some people have trouble digesting that. Would someone benefit better with a greens powder that way if they're struggling with fiber, or is that going to still add the same amount of fiber into their diet?
So it's not going to add the same amount of fiber at all. And I always think about greens powders, and this is not a correct way to say it in terms of technicalities, but they're almost in a way pre-digested, right? So you don't have to work as hard to break down and extract the nutrients from a greens powder. Whereas for someone who maybe has poor digestion, a lot of people with IBS, they actually have what's called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. So a lot of times, those types of people, they just do terrible with fiber. If you eat more vegetables, the gas, the bloating, everything gets so much worse. So for them, actually cutting back on the vegetables and going with the greens powder is a great way to, get your alkalinity, get your nutrients in, etc., without actually aggravating all of the symptoms that you're experiencing.
Now, if somebody is eating 8 cups of vegetables a day, would you still recommend them to supplement with a greens powder?
I would say yes, and the reason why is, it gets a little nuanced because you got to look at what type of vegetables, right? So for 4 servings of potatoes per day, well, there's not a lot of nutrient value in there. So I think it really depends. And I think the other thing I would say is, just to back up a step, I always think about core nutrition, right? So, in the world of supplements now, there are literally tens of thousands of supplements, and a lot of people are just taking all kinds of stuff that they don't really need to be taking. So I always, as a clinician, I always say there's a big difference between what you're doing therapeutically versus what you're doing long-term, right? Or maintenance-wise. So when you think about core nutrition, think about lower dosage, think about broad spectrum nutrients and that synergistic effect. Okay, so I always think of, core nutrition. Greens powder is part of your core nutrition, whether you're eating well, whether you're eating poorly, whatever it is. A greens powder is a great staple that should always be part of your diet. Whereas I think isolated, do we all need to be taking high doses of curcumin every day? I don't think so. Do we all need to be taking high doses of zinc and selenium and whatever? I don't think so. Right, but I think greens powders are a staple, should be a staple anyway, of pretty much anyone's diet.
Yes, I absolutely agree. It's something that you will need for longevity, for energy, for so many different things. But what we do know is on the market, there's obviously a lot of greens powders, and there's a lot of different ways in which they're formulated as well. So can you talk about how Botanica formulates their greens powder?
Yeah, I can speak to it a little bit. Obviously, I'm not in the production side of things, so I'll share as much as I know. But I think what you're going to find, and I started noticing this trend many years ago. Actually, I used to work in retail when I first got into the field, so I know the retail space very well, and I know the products very well. But what started to happen is people load up their formulations with dozens and dozens of ingredients, right? So all of a sudden, you get a greens powder that says, "Well, we've got 78 different ingredients in there," but then everything is sort of 5 milligrams of this, 10 milligrams of that. And the way I was always trained was use fewer ingredients at higher potencies is better. So when you look at the greens powders, you're going to notice that, right? There's not a ton of stuff in there. I think if I recall, it's around 12 ingredients, give or take. So we've got the grasses, we've got your blue-green algae, we've got some superfruits in there, depending on which formula. So when it comes to the greens specifically, right, I'm not going to speak too much about the superfruits or the chocolate and that sort of thing because they're sourced from different places. But we use Canadian grass, first of all, and we use the tips of the grass. So if you look at what happens when you sprout food, for example, when you sprout a food, the nutrient value jumps up in the sprout. Like that's why people eat sprouts, right? For higher nutrient levels. And you'll see that in certain instances, things like potassium in a sprout can actually increase by 1,500%. Okay, so that's 1,500%. Like I don't even know how they do that. It's an astronomical jump. And it's almost like the power and the energy of that sprout, coming into a plant, it's just pulls all of its nutrients together and just drives it right up. Now, when you couple that with growing something in a cold environment, what you have is a very robust, hardy type of plant, right? And that's why we use the tips of Canadian grasses grown in cold weather. What we'll do as well is the processing is very minimal, so there's not a lot of processing, if that makes sense. We're using very gentle methods of dehydration. Things are hand blended and so forth. And then, of course, as I said earlier, we've got those higher potencies, right? So we've got like 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams or hundreds of milligrams of greens or the ingredients versus sprinklings of 5 or 10, and then putting that on the front of the label, saying, hey, we have reishi and we have this and we have that. And then you turn the label around and it's like the last ingredient and it's 2 milligrams. Yeah, so I think hopefully that's a good answer for you and kind of sums things up to some degree anyway.
Yes, I absolutely. And I think it's important that you mentioned that sometimes the marketing on certain products of having XYZ or having, 50 different ingredients in there, it's the same with probiotics. I'm finding right now is not always is it better to have more. Sometimes it's better to have lower with a higher concentration that's actually going to have a therapeutic effect on the body in terms of digestion and energy. So that's great.
One thing I wanted to just add as well, there's a couple of things. You will also notice in our formulations that we don't use any herbs. And part of why we don't do that is so that we make them safe if you're on medication. So there's no drug herb interactions at all. It's just food, right? The second thing I'll say, just coming back to your point on the broad spectrum side of things and having too many ingredients, is once you have too many ingredients, especially in sensitive people, you really open the door to allergenicity and these types of allergic type of reactions. And if you've got all those ingredients going on, you have no idea what the person is reacting to. So keeping it simple and actually having a higher dosage is way better for sensitive people.
With the Botanica greens, there are some specific certifications that are on these greens powdered products. Can you elaborate on what those are and why they're important to have on a green supplement powder?
Yeah, I mean, the big ones, if you really get into them, you'll see that they're all organic, first of all. And I think, we can all agree that organic is really the way to go for so many different reasons. Organic farming is really the way forward in terms of sustainability, in terms of, no chemicals, in terms of no genetically modified organisms, and of course, then the chemicals such as Roundup and stuff like that. Like, obviously we don't want any of that. So the organic is really the sort of bedrock, if you will, for the entire all of the products. But we do have things like soy-free, right? So soy-free, legume-free. Not so much in the greens powders that it's a problem, but definitely in the protein powders. Noticed that over the last few years, a lot of people are starting to react to peas suddenly. And this is why, pea protein has kind of fallen out of favor in many ways. And this is why we don't use peas in our protein powder. But you'll also see that we don't have any legumes. We're not using soy. Everything is vegan, obviously. So we want to kind of appeal to people that are following a vegan or more of a predominantly plant-based diet. Obviously, there's no dairy, there's no gluten. I want to just talk about gluten for just 1 minute, because there's often a lot of confusion when you look at greens powders, right? Because you'll see in there things like barley grass, right? You might see, wheatgrass, for example, and people, automatically go, oh my gosh, it's wheat. Wheat is bad, right? So first of all, everything is organic is one thing. But second of all, when you have something organic, you know that it's not genetically modified. Okay, so there's that side of things. But when it comes to gluten, it's important for people to understand that the gluten is a protein. Okay, so it's a protein molecule that's found in pretty much all grains. So even your traditionally gluten-free grains actually do have gluten-like proteins in them. But you find the gluten in the grain part of it. Okay, not in the grass. So that's very important for people because, a lot of people will see it and they will shy away, and then they will ask, well, how can it have wheatgrass, but it's also gluten-free? Okay, that's the explanation right there, is the grass itself does not have any gluten in it. Okay, it's the grain. Okay, so yeah, so those are some of the certifications that we have, and I think just to, basically address some of those common questions that come up, I'm sure. And you would probably know better than I do, especially working in a store.
Yeah, I know when I first entered the industry, like even before I was a nutritionist, I remember looking at greens powder because I'm celiac. So whenever I would look at protein powders or greens powders, I always got so nervous. I was like, how is this possible that it's the grass that's in there? But that's a perfect description of how that differs between the grain versus the grass. So it is safe for celiacs to also have greens powder by Botanica.
Yeah, and in fact, it's actually very good for celiacs for a number of reasons, and for anyone with inflammatory bowel diseases, so your Crohn's, your ulcerative colitis, and stuff like that. What you find is in the greens, especially the barley grass, the wheatgrass, and stuff like that. There's an enzyme called actually an antioxidant enzyme called superoxide dismutase, or SOD, and SOD is a very, very powerful free radical scavenger. So, especially in the GI tract with people with a lot of inflammation, there's a lot of free radical damage going on. And so you'll actually find that by shifting the pH to be more alkaline, by having things like SOD in there, you'll find that you start balancing out the pH of the GI tract and get the inflammation way down as well. Which again, when you couple that with the therapeutic diet and maybe some other supplements on top of that, you can really make inroads into those types of disorders. And that's what I do in my clinic. I mean, I coach practitioners. I have a masterclass for practitioners who are in clinic. And so, digestion and gut health is I live and breathe it every single day. And so I speak from personal experience with that over a long period of time.
Yes, the gut health is really the foundation of where you start in terms of healing and starting to feel better. And it's important to really nourish that and make sure it's healthy. So you mentioned with GI issues and digestion problems, but who else could benefit from having a greens powder? I know you said like everyone would be great to have the greens powder added into their routine, but is there any other specific health concerns that people could benefit from having a greens powder?
I mean, the things that come to mind, if you're dealing with any type of inflammatory issue, right? So that could be, inflammation is the silent killer. It's involved with heart disease, with, arthritis, like there's so many cancers and what have you. So I think that anyone who's suffering from any type of inflammatory issue could definitely benefit from greens powders. As I said, the antioxidant side of things is one thing, but also all of the micronutrients. So your trace minerals, your macro minerals, really, what they do is when you shift the body into a more alkaline state, your inflammatory load tends to come down. Okay, because disease doesn't like an alkaline body. So I think the inflammation side of things, obviously we spoke about gut health as well. So if people are trying to get a lot of nutrients in without having to work too hard on the digestion side of things, that's absolutely. Your athletes, so that's another one. Athletes, whether you want to do it pre-workout, post-workout, because when you exercise, what happens is we produce a lot of free radicals. When you exercise, people always think of free radicals coming in from the outside, right? So smoke, smog, air pollution, etc. But the majority of free radicals are actually made by the mitochondria in the cells of our body. That's where most of our free radical production comes in. When you upregulate that and when you exercise a lot, i.e. in the case of athletes, what you're actually doing is you're also upregulating your free radical production. And so again, a greens powder that's very, very high potency will obviously help to mitigate a lot of that damage. So I would also say, kids are a huge demographic that's often overlooked because, we think of kids, and it's true, kids are very resilient. Kids, obviously, they're by far the healthiest population that we have in terms of demographics. But kids also are picky eaters. They don't like to eat tons of vegetables. And I know I have 3 kids, so I can attest to it. Even as a nutritionist, it's very challenging sometimes. But if you look at 2 of our products, since we're talking about Botanica, the Perfect Greens chocolate and the Perfect Greens, the superfruit one, what you're going to find with those two is they're very, very palatable for people who actually don't necessarily like greens powders, if that makes sense. So, I'm sure you get it. A lot of people will come in and go, oh my gosh, I'm so confused about nutrition. I don't know what to eat. I don't know what supplements I should be taking. Someone said I should take a greens powder to throw it in my smoothie or to just have it, with almond milk or something like that. And if you give them our original formulas, which is just the straight perfect greens, it's so concentrated and it tastes so green that those types of people really don't like that. They're like, well, I want the greens, but I don't want the green taste. And so kids are very much like that. You try and give a child straight greens powders and they do not like it at all. So the superfruit tastes like fruit punch, and the chocolate one tastes just like chocolate. You wouldn't even know that there are vegetables in there. So I think that for children, that's really great. And also for elderly. The elderly, a lot of times digestion is really poor. They've had a lifetime of wear and tear. Oftentimes they are on medications. They've, got diagnosed diseases and so forth. And for them, again, eating lots and lots of vegetables is just not practical because they don't want to spend the time preparing it. They don't want to, cook it, spend, a long time eating it. So I think that the greens powders for them, again, especially those ones that are not super, super green, it's a great way to just get nutrition into them without taxing the digestive system.
Yes. So at Joanne's Place, we do have the perfect greens, the original flavor, the superfruit, and the chocolate. So between those three, like the profiles of greens are the same. It's just the flavor that's different, correct?
They're similar. I will say the original formula has a lot more greens in it. So if you actually look at and I'll probably botch the exact numbers, but it's somewhere around 7,300 milligrams or 7,600 milligrams. So that is the highest concentration of greens per serving for any greens powder in Canada. Just so you know, wow. The highest concentration per serving. But once you get into the flavors, obviously we have to take things down a notch so that we can add in the flavors, right? So the chocolate one has the lowest amount of greens because it's got the chocolate as the flavor, right? But when you get into the superfruit one, the greens go down a little bit, but now we have superfruits. So you've still got all of the nutrition, the antioxidants, the phytonutrients, etc., from the fruits. But if you look at the label, the greens themselves will obviously be a little bit lower.
And all three of these you mentioned you can either add into smoothies, but they're also able to just mix in water and dissolve, correct?
Yeah, I mean, like anything that's plant-based, it's not going to fully dissolve in water per se. There's always going to be a little bit of chalkiness, if you will. But, I find mixing them with water, you can also mix them with your favorite, if you've got a nut milk of any kind, almond milk, oat milk tends to work really well because it's a little sweeter. So any of the nut milks or adding them to a smoothie, and then you can really get creative. I find for me personally, this is just me, I find that buying the actual greens, so the perfect greens, which is the highest concentration, and then adding that to a smoothie works very well, even for people who don't necessarily like the taste of greens, because now you can add blueberries and bananas and coconut milk and whatever else you want, and you kind of hide the greenness, if you will, but you're still getting all of that good nutrition in you.
Yes, that's how I also prefer to take it. But as we know, when we start to change our diet and alkalize our system and we get rid of the foods that literally change our taste buds, it doesn't seem as green when we're having these greens powders on their own. So it's really that transitional phase of, yes, start adding them into your smoothies, or some people might add them into orange juice or a nut milk or something like that. And then eventually, when you start to alkalize the system and get rid of that toxic buildup from processed foods and sugars and things like that, you start to realize, actually, this doesn't taste too bad. And I can actually handle it just in water and start to, bump yourself up from the chocolate to the superfruit and then up to the original perfect greens. So yeah, that's one way to look at it as well.
Yeah, 100%, and again, everything is a transition, right? You're never going to get someone from eating, McDonald's and next week they're going to be eating sprouted quinoa and what have you. So there's always, that transition, as you said. And I find the same is for kids, actually. So my kids and generally kids, I know we're talking about greens powder, for some reason, they love chlorella. Actually, just taking the tablets and just eating the chlorella tablets, they love it. And so I find that my little guy, he's 5, he'll have like 3 or 4 chlorella tablets in the morning pretty much every day. And, the greens powders as well, like he really likes the superfruit one for obvious reasons because he's a little kid. But we kind of make milkshakes, quote unquote, and put that in. And it's a good way, but, it's also fostering good eating habits for children so that once they do get older, my daughter is 13, and with her, like, she's happy to eat a salad. Like, she's fine with that. She's happy to eat steamed broccoli. Like, her palate is kind of being trained, if you will, to appreciate those foods. And sure, she's a teenager, so she's obviously going to eat whatever else she wants with her friends. But 80% of the time she's at home and she's eating well, and she's got a good, healthy palate for those types of foods, which is good.
That's good. Yes, it really starts in those foundational years of really implementing that. And I know for myself, when I was younger, I was a family with 4 kids, so it wasn't always the top priority to have salads and fresh greens and things. But, down the road, when you run into the health concerns, things change very quickly. And when you need to regain your health, you can use supplements and things like that to get yourself back to a point of just feeling good again.
Basically speed things up. That's what supplements do. But always a supplement to a good diet. I think people forget about that,
Absolutely. The supplements can only take you so far. You still really got to put the work in on your everyday routine as well. So in terms of the greens, like you mentioned that you have it in your smoothie in the morning, but is there a preferred time of the day in which someone should take their greens, morning versus night, with food, without food?
Yeah, so it really depends on the person. I think the straight answer for one of those questions is don't take it with food. Okay. I find that, if you have a meal and then you also add greens to that, it just kind of gets lost in the shuffle. And for a lot of people, it will actually impact digestion, if you will, because you've just added so much water and greens on top of whatever your meal is. So having them either on an empty stomach or adding it to a smoothie, which is different, right? So adding it to a smoothie where everything is blended up, that's obviously a pretty stock standard way of getting greens in. To the other part of your question, which is there a preferred time of day? There's not really a preferred time of day, okay? What I will say is it really depends on how sensitive you are. So for some people, they do find that greens powder really gives them energy, okay? For a lot of people, they don't necessarily notice that. So I would say if you notice that greens powder really gives you energy, you might not want to take it later in the day because, it's going to give you energy and then you perhaps might not be able to sleep. However, if you look at some of the ingredients in there, if you look at your chlorellas, for example, and some of the other compounds in there, you will see that at night we detoxify, right? So if you're really looking to greens powders to detoxify and to help you with that, then perhaps taking it, mid-afternoon as a snack, if you will, or perhaps even taking it, closer to bedtime. Is again another good way to kind of get that in there so that the body is doing its repair work while it sleeps. The other way to use it is, a lot of people are doing intermittent fasting now, right? And so typically, you wake up and instead of having breakfast, you'll just kind of coast until 10 or 11 o'clock, maybe even later for some people. So I find that, and again, technically speaking, a greens powder is probably going to break your fast because you are going to find that there's 30 calories in there. But is it a train smash? I don't think so at all, right? So you could wake up in the morning and at some point as a snack, getting nutrients in without the high calories, you could incorporate this as part of an intermittent fasting lifestyle. And in fact, that's what I do with a lot of my clients in clinic. Once we kind of really get them over the hump and get them to a place of maintenance, I will actually use things like amino acids and greens powders and say, well, look, because for a lot of people with intermittent fasting, what will happen is their adrenal glands are not strong enough to actually fast properly, right? So they got a lot of stress, they may be carrying a lot of extra weight, and they have blood sugar issues is another one. And so now they go for these long periods of fasting and you just keep hammering your adrenal glands all day long. So I find that actually having amino acids or protein, so even a protein powder, doing that and then doing a greens powder, scattered throughout the morning, it kind of just helps alleviate some of the stress on the adrenal glands. And it can also help, I wouldn't say balance your blood sugar, but at least stop it from bottoming out. And then kind of get on with your meals, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning. So, so those are some ways. Again, as I said, people are sometimes using it as a pre-workout or a post-workout. And maybe you could, add some herbs in there as well if you want, or amino acids.
Yes, and one of the things you just mentioned there that I want to dive a little deeper into is the benefit of increased energy, which is fantastic. And I think everybody could use that little extra pick me up. But is there any other benefits that people will experience by taking a greens powder?
I mean, it's difficult to say because it depends on the person, right? So, typically the sort of keynotes for greens powders are going to be things like alkalinity. Okay, so getting the body more alkaline, and the ripple effect from that is going to vary greatly from person to person, right? Inflammation is another one, so a very powerful anti-inflammatory. We know that there's obviously a high nutrient concentration as well. So, if a person is deficient in nutrients, well, it all depends on what nutrient they're deficient in, right? I think those are probably the biggest points, to be honest. Everything else kind of follows from there when you look into it. But I always think of greens powder. It's just a way to bump up your daily nutrition. That's really it. Because the focus these days should really be. It's not about calories in versus calories out. It's about getting the right amount of calories in. But the more nutrient dense those calories are, the better off you are. Because if you take a look around out there, we basically have a nation, dare I say, a global society of people that are overfed and undernourished, right? So we've got plenty of calories coming in, but those calories are empty calories because the nutrient levels are low. So what we should be doing is, I'm not a huge fan of calorie restriction by any stretch, but we should be eating the right amount of calories based on our energetic needs, and we should be getting as much nutrients as we can into those calories that we're consuming. And what better way to do it than greens powder?
Yes, I completely agree. The choices that we have in front of us that are calorie limited, like the 100-calorie snacks or the certain calorie meals, trying to get away from that idea that, you can have the hamburger at only, XYZ amount of calories, but it doesn't compare in terms of the nutritional value that a salad or a soup or a sandwich with greens and good quality meat on top of that would really benefit the body. So it's really important to highlight that it's not just about the calories, it's where it's coming from, the other nutrients that you're getting from that as well.
If I can add to that, hunger, so let's talk about hunger as well for a minute, because people often think I'm hungry for calories, right? I need calories. My body needs energy. But what you'll find is you're actually hungry for nutrients. And so you'll find that once you start including greens powder and you get your nutrient levels up, you'll actually find that your cravings go down. So, a lot of those cravings, just again, for those empty calorie foods, those high sugar foods, I've had people that have had addictions to Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper. And when you start loading them up with 3 servings of greens powder a day, you do that for 10 days or 2 weeks. And all of a sudden they're like, wow, I don't feel like I need the drink anymore. I'm off the sugar. I'm off the whatever it is that I'm hooked on. So I think there's a lot to be said for that as well, especially because people are dealing, we've got an obesity epidemic. People are looking at weight is a big problem. And of course, with weight comes hunger issues or cravings and that sort of stuff. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there as well.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's true. Like we're constantly looking for something, and it's not even necessarily always food. Like we're always on the hunt for something to satisfy a feeling, an emotion. And sometimes, not even sometimes, a lot of the time, we resort to specific foods to, fill those voids or feel satisfied. And we don't always choose the best options. But not to say that that's bad. It's not bad to have the chocolate. It's not bad to have whatever your food is, but it's important to make sure that your other choices are really elevating your nutrient level or your nutrient intake and, providing you with that fuel and vitamins and minerals and all of the goods. So that's fantastic. I just have one other question for you.
Yeah.
I just want to know, and our listeners will want to know, is there any case in which someone should not be taking a greens powder?
It's a tricky question. And again, with the Botanica greens powders, because we are using fewer ingredients, they tend to be very well tolerated by people. I would say the only instance really is if you're on medication, you want to do your homework a little bit, particularly if you're on blood thinning medication. So blood thinning medication, greens typically have a lot of vitamin K in them, which is great. So, we obviously need vitamin K. It's very important. But vitamin K actually stands for coagulant, right? And so that's what vitamin K does, is it coagulates or it thickens the blood. So I would say, I haven't personally had any issues with that. I've never heard of any reports, but just to do my due diligence here, I would say just look into that a little bit more. And the only other instance I would say is if people are allergic to something that's in there. Right, that's sort of the obvious one. Again, I haven't heard of people having negative reactions at all to our greens powders. So again, just throwing that out there as a cautionary note. If you are very, very sensitive, if you're also very sensitive to detoxification, just know that greens powders will, very gently anyway, they will kind of kickstart the detoxification process. And if you've got maybe infections or you've got yeast issues or something like that in the gut, sometimes a greens powder can stir that up. Not that it's going to be a forever problem. It might just stir things up for 3 or 4 days once you first start taking it, and then kind of settle down a little bit.
Yes, that's good to note. And even in that case, some people will take probably less of a scoop or a dosage to also still get the benefits, but without overdoing it until they're able to address those other issues that are going on, like candida or yeast overgrowth, bacterial overgrowth as well too.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So just a recap for you guys that are listening, at Joanne's Place, we do carry the Botanica greens, which is what we highlighted in today's podcast. We have the unflavored original perfect greens, the superfruit, and the chocolate as well. So if you guys want to start to add this into your daily routine, please pop in, talk to one of our supplement specialists so we can help to find the right one that's suited for you. So thank you so much, Brett, for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure, and I know that our listeners are really going to benefit from hearing this episode.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in and prioritizing your wellness journey with us. You know what to do. Subscribe to our channel, share on social media that you're listening to the Wellness on Purpose podcast, and stay tuned for the next episode.